In December of 1934, deep beneath the Arsenal Tower of the Moscow Kremlin, a Russian archaeologist by the name of Ignatius Stiletsky crawled through a tunnel. At the end, according to the accounts he later left behind, he came face to face with a massive iron door fitted with bolts and a small viewing window, but he didn't get to open it. Soviet officials halted the dig, sealed the entrance, and offered no public explanation. A few weeks earlier, the prominent Bolshevik Sergei Kirov had been cut down in Leningrad. The regime suddenly had bigger concerns than letting an obsessive academic poke around the foundations of the seat of Soviet power. Stiletsky would never get to go back, and he died in 1949 with the door still closed and whatever was behind it still unseen. The thing he believed was on the other side of that door was a collection of books, and not just any books. These were Greco-Roman codices smuggled out of Constantinople before the Ottoman cannons brought down the walls. Latin and Greek manuscripts thought lost for millennia. This hoard had a name in Russian sources, the Libreia, from the Latin liber, meaning book, but in English we tend to call it the Lost Library of Ivan the Terrible. To understand why anyone would believe such a thing existed in the first place, we have to back up to a wedding in Rome in June of 1472. The bride was Sophia Palaeologina, niece of Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor of Constantinople. She'd been raised under papal protection after her family fled the Ottoman conquest of 1453, and she was being married off to Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow. This was a deal brokered by Pope Paul II that the Vatican hoped would bring the Russian Church back into the Catholic fold. That part of the plan went nowhere, but Sophia made the trip anyway, sailing from the Hanseatic port of Lübeck across the Baltic, before ultimately arriving in Moscow that November. According to the legend that grew up around her, she didn't arrive empty-handed. Buried somewhere in her dowry caravan were chests of books, salvaged manuscripts that her uncle Thomas Palaiologos had supposedly hauled out of the doomed ancient capital. Some accounts put the count at around 800 volumes of books. Other versions go further and trace the collection's origins back through the Imperial Library of Constantinople to the wreckage of the Library of Alexandria itself. The most extreme versions of the legend even go so far as to claim that the collection contained ancient Egyptian writings and texts from as far away as China. This is the part where you need to apply a little historical skepticism because there's almost no contemporary documentary evidence that Sophia brought any books at all. The Russian chronicles that record her marriage and her 31 years as Grand Princess are remarkably quiet about her supposed literary cargo. Modern scholars who've gone looking for the trail have come up completely empty. A systematic study of Greek manuscripts known to have existed in Moscow, conducted in the 1960s, found nothing that could be traced back to a collection arriving with Sophia. The academic who spearheaded this study determined that the most plausible reading of the surviving sources is that the imperial collection stayed with the Ottomans. The romantic version of Sophia's wedding caravan, according to this historian, was mostly a thing later writers built around her after the fact. And I tend to believe this for another reason that this historian didn't specifically raise. Princess Sophia was raised under the protection of the papacy. Had the Pope gotten word that Sophia was potentially hauling around the most valuable collection of books in the world, I find it unlikely she would have been allowed to keep them. However, even on the off chance they weren't confiscated, it's even more unlikely that the church scholars wouldn't have taken a crack at these texts during her decades in Italy. The library makes its first real entrance into the historical record in 1518, almost half a century after Sophia's arrival, in the form of a Greek monk from Mount Athos. His name was Michael Trivolis, though history remembers him as Maximus the Greek, which I must say is a ridiculously good name for an Orthodox monk. Sophia's son, Grand Prince Vasily III, had written to the monks at Mount Athos, requesting a translator who could render certain Greek religious texts into Church Slavonic. One of the monasteries sent Maximus, who arrived in Moscow that year, and was reportedly granted an audience with the prince that included a tour of the royal book collection. According to the account that survives, Maximus was floored, and he told Vasily that even in Greece itself, he'd never seen so many Greek volumes assembled in one place. That single line is the seed from which the entire legend grows. Without it, there's almost nothing to suggest the library ever existed. With it, you suddenly have a highly credible Greek scholar attesting to a Russian royal collection of unusual scale and quality. But here's the problem with leaning too hard on Maximus's testimony, and that's the fact that we don't actually have it from the Greek monk directly. The story comes to us through a biography written by Prince Andrei Kurbsky, a Muscovite nobleman who knew Maximus, and even that text is contested. In the 19th century, Russian historians came to question whether the text was authentic at all, or whether it was simply a way to puff up the grandeur of Moscow. In essence, the argument is that when Maximus arrived, Moscow was an intellectual backwater on the edges of Europe. By having a great Greek scholar claim to be floored by the library kept by the Muscovites, this was essentially a retcon to make the Russians look more important than they were at the time. This is a common practice throughout history, especially when a state has a rapidly ascendant arc like Moscow would ultimately have. In one of my previous videos, I've discussed how great Roman writers basically wrote historical fiction about why Alexander the Great didn't bother to try to conquer them. This claim that Maximus was stunned by the volumes kept by this then backwards principality is a similar sort of impulse. Russians in the 18th century had long lost sight of the fact that in 1472, when Princess Sophia came to them, they weren't the great continent-spanning empire they were by then. The Muscovite Russians at the time were still technically subjects of the remainder of the Golden Horde, and most certainly not on the forefront of scholarship yet. The next major appearance of the library comes from Livonia, the territory we'd today call Latvia and Estonia. A Baltic German writer named Franz Neustadt, working at the start of the 17th century, included in his chronicle the story of a Lutheran pastor named Johannes Federmann. Federmann had been brought to Moscow in the 1560s or 1570s and was reportedly summoned by Ivan the Terrible himself. The Tsar showed him into a locked storeroom somewhere in the Kremlin and asked him to survey what was inside. What the German found, according to the chronicle, was an enormous collection of ancient books, many of which he recognized only by reputation, because the originals had been thought lost. It's a great story, but it also has serious credibility issues, since Federmann himself never wrote any of this down. The chronicle was compiled roughly 30 years after the supposed event by a man who wasn't there, and no one ever produced a single title from the collection allegedly catalogued. Adding to this, the chronicler claimed that Federmann may have been eliminated by Ivan the Terrible to protect the secret of the collection. While this is technically possible, to me this reads a lot like myth-making surrounding the lost library. The next big piece of supposed evidence surfaced in 1819, when a Baltic German legal historian named Christian von Dabilov made a big claim. Working in the archives of Parnu in what's now Estonia, Dabilov claimed to have found a document titled Manuscripts Held by the Tsar. According to Dabilov, the list was extraordinary, and it listed numerous lost works of Livy, Cicero, and Virgil that were allegedly held by Ivan the Terrible. It was the kind of inventory that would, if real, rewrite huge chunks of classical scholarship overnight. Dabilov copied down portions of the document, then left Parnu to share his find with a colleague at the University of Dorpat. When he returned, the document was allegedly gone, and try as he might, he could never locate it again. That said, A vanished list of impossibly perfect contents discovered by a single scholar who can't produce his evidence is, generally speaking, not how real archival finds work. That said, it's technically possible, which I believe I've said a few times throughout this segment now. None of this historical uncertainty ever stopped the searches, though, and even Peter the Great ordered an investigation into the lost library, but found nothing. Napoleon reportedly believed that the lost library was real, and when he marched into the city in September 1812, he may have also ordered a search for the collection. If anything was found during this period, there's no record of it, and it remains a possibility that Napoleon's name was just attached to a growing legend. In the 1890s, a German scholar spent months in Moscow chasing the legend after he became convinced that a Homeric manuscript had been brought there by Sophia Palaiologina. He concluded that it was almost certainly in a library that was somewhere beneath the Kremlin, but he wasn't able to get approval for an expedition in the seat of Russian power. It turns out that the idea of blasting apart a portion of the Moscow Kremlin wasn't the most appealing idea to the Russians at the time. And then there was Stiletsky, the man who I mentioned at the start of this segment, and he was a different kind of obsessive entirely. Born in 1878 in what's now Ukraine, he stumbled across what he believed was Dabylov's catalog while working in the Parnu archives in 1914. Now let's just say the next few years were a bit rough around the edges for Russia as a whole, so despite his belief nothing happened for a decade and a half. In 1929, the Soviet government finally gave him permission to dig under the Kremlin, but there were substantial delays. Excavations began on December 1st, 1933 beneath the Arsenal Tower. But then just over a year later, after Kirov was eliminated and Stalin's purges began swallowing up everything in Soviet life, the dig was shut down. Stiletsky lived through the Axis siege of Moscow, and if you expected that this made him more focused on basic survival, you'd be wrong. He thought that finding these documents during the siege may be a morale boost of sorts, and petitioned to resume his digging. Unsurprisingly, the Soviets, facing civilizational annihilation, had slightly bigger issues to handle at the time. So that leaves us with what's down there and what isn't. And the honest answer to all of this is that we don't know for sure. There was almost certainly a large collection of books in the Kremlin during the periods in question, so the idea of a lost royal book archive isn't completely fanciful. However, the idea of a sealed underground vault containing the lost works of antiquity brought by a Greek princess and untouched since the 16th century is something else entirely. The most likely explanation for the library's disappearance, if anything ever disappeared, is the most boring one. Moscow was a wooden city that burned spectacularly and often, sometimes wiping out entire neighborhoods within a single afternoon. The Great Fires of 1547, 1571, and 1626 each leveled enormous portions of the city and consumed countless manuscripts in the process. The time of troubles brought Polish occupation, sustained looting, and the dispersal of court possessions across the rest of Europe. But, that said, if Stiletsky is to be believed, that iron door is still down there, somewhere beneath the Arsenal Tower, waiting for someone to open it. When most people picture the Roman Empire, they see togas, marble forums, and senators sparring in Latin. But it's easy to forget that Rome didn't actually fall in 476, and the eastern half of the empire kept going for nearly another 1,000 years out of Constantinople. But somewhere during that long echo, something quiet and strange happened. The language of Scipio Africanus, of Cicero, of Virgil, and of Julius Caesar slowly drifted out of the mouths of the men who sat on the Roman throne. The emperors still called themselves Romans, and they still issued laws in Latin, at least for a while. They still styled themselves as the heirs of Augustus and would never stop doing so. But sometime during this period, the tongue they actually grew up speaking had completely changed. And the man who stood at the final edge of that change, the last Roman emperor who grew up genuinely speaking Latin as his first language, is someone you've almost certainly heard of. His name was Justinian, and his story was truly unusual even by the standards of one of the greatest Roman emperors in history. Justinian wasn't born into the purple by any means, quite the opposite. He came into the world around 482 in a small village called Tauresium, in the Balkan region of Dardania in what's now North Macedonia. His family were peasant farmers with no real claim to nobility, and his birth name wasn't even Justinian. It was Petrus Sabatius, a thoroughly Latin name for a person in a region where Latin had settled in centuries earlier as the common tongue of colonists, soldiers, and administrators. That geography matters more than it sounds. The Balkans in the late 5th century sat on a linguistic fault line. South and east of it, Greek dominated the cities, the churches, and the markets. North and west, especially in old provinces like Illyricum, Dalmatia, and Dardania, Latin had sunk deep roots in the rural population. Peasant families there weren't speaking the polished Latin of Roman senators. Theirs was a tough, rustic Latin. It was the kind soldiers picked up in garrison towns and passed down to their children around the hearth. That's the language the future Justinian grew up hearing in his mother's kitchen, and it's the one he'd carry with him into the imperial court. None of this would matter to history if not for the boy's uncle, a rough-edged career soldier named Justin. Justin had walked down from the same Dardanian hills to Constantinople as a young man, enlisted in the imperial guard, and slowly clawed his way up through the ranks. By the time he was old, he commanded the Excubitors, the elite palace guard, one of the most powerful military posts in the empire. He could barely read or write by most accounts, but he understood politics in a deep way. Justin brought his nephew down to the capital, paid for an education in rhetoric, theology, and law, and had him formally adopted as his heir. Petrus Sabatius was given the new name Justinian, a deliberate echo of his uncle and patron. When the old emperor Anastasius died in 518 without naming a successor, the guards maneuvered Justin onto the throne. For the next 9 years, the elderly Justin ruled in name, while the now polished and lawyerly Justinian worked behind the curtain. When Justin passed away in 527, the nephew, the boy who had once been a peasant farmer, slid his way onto the throne. Both men, uncle and nephew, sat on the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire while being native speakers of Latin in a city that had become overwhelmingly Greek. Constantinople, by the 6th century, was a Greek-speaking metropolis. The church preached in Greek. The markets haggled in Greek. Everything was in Greek. Across Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, most of Justinian's subjects spoke Greek, Coptic, Aramaic, or something else entirely. Latin was the language of the government, the army's paperwork, and the law, but it was no longer the language of the streets he governed. Contemporary observers picked up on the tension between Justinian and his people, especially in the highest halls of power. The historian Procopius, who served as a legal advisor on Justinian's military campaigns, eventually turned around and wrote a venomous secret history of the regime. He recorded an emperor whose provincial Balkan origins were obvious at court, and that this was something of an embarrassment. If Procopius is to be believed, the Greeks at the court essentially saw Justinian and his family as a 6th century version of the Beverly Hillbillies. Modern scholars reading this account argue that while Justinian was fluent in Greek, he likely didn't speak it at a refined native level. Further, for complex diplomatic and legal matters, he preferred his own mother tongue of Latin over the ascendant Greek language. Justinian's most famous project shows this vividly. Between 529 and 534, he commissioned a massive overhaul of Roman law. He pulled together centuries of legal opinions, imperial edicts, and legal textbooks into one coherent body. The result, the Corpus Juris Civilis, would become the bedrock of European legal thought for the next 1,500 years. And he had it compiled in Latin, because in his mind, and in the minds of his lawyers, the law of Rome was naturally and obviously a Latin thing. To compose it in Greek may have felt like cutting the empire loose from its own foundations, which Justinian believed himself to represent. Reality crept in anyway, and later in his reign, Justinian issued a flood of new laws, the novellae, and more of these appeared in Greek rather than Latin. He was pragmatic, and if the courts and the provinces needed Greek to apply the law day to day, Greek they would get. Even the emperor who spoke Latin at home couldn't hold back the tide forever, and after all, Greek had arguably always been the true prestige language of the Romans anyway. The other part of Justinian's legacy worth thinking about in this context is his obsession with the West. He poured enormous resources and burned through a generation of soldiers trying to take back the lost western provinces. His generals Belisarius and Narses clawed North Africa away from the Vandal kingdom and Italy away from the Ostrogoths. For a flickering moment, Rome itself once again answered to a Roman emperor, a Latin-speaking one, ruling from the east. It's tempting to read his Western campaigns as the project of a man who felt the Latin world slipping away beneath his feet and wanted desperately to hold it together. Whether or not that's psychologically accurate, the effect was the same. Justinian tried to stitch the Latin half of the Mediterranean back onto the Greek-speaking empire. The reconquest proved fragile, and much of Italy fell to the Lombards within a few years of his death. The North African recovery held longer but collapsed under the Arab conquests of the 7th century. After Justinian died in 565, the thread of Latin frayed increasingly quickly. His successor, his nephew Justin II, was raised in Constantinople and is generally described by modern historians as a Greek speaker first, with Latin as a second language. Notably, some have argued that Justin II may have actually been the last native Latin-speaking emperor, though if he was, he spoke Greek and Latin with equal fluency. The emperors who followed, like Tiberius II and Maurice, leaned further into Greek, although Latin clung on in the army, the court, and legal ceremony for decades yet. The decisive shift came under Heraclius, who took the throne in 610. During his reign, Greek displaced Latin as the working language of imperial administration in practice, not by any clean decree, and the change stuck. The imperial title itself shifted at this time, with the old Latin imperator giving way to the Greek basileus. From that point on, every Roman emperor, all the way to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, was a Greek speaker by birth and upbringing. Justinian almost certainly didn't know he was the last of his linguistic kind, and he acted like a man standing squarely inside his tradition. He fully believed himself part of an unbroken lineage reaching all the way back to Augustus, and he spent a reign of nearly 40 years acting on that assumption. But Justinian was already an anachronism, and the city around him had been Greek through and through for generations. In the East, Latin had slowly become the first language of rustic provincial types, and anyone who wanted to be anyone had long realized Greek was the language that opened doors. The church was in the middle of defining itself in Greek, and every year the population of the empire became more and more Hellenized. And one day, of course, there would be Roman emperors who not only spoke Greek as their first language, but emperors who didn't understand Latin at all. But that historical question is a story for another segment in another future video. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to hit subscribe button and the notification bell. Also, don't forget to share this video with your friends and family or post the links to your social media accounts. Also, after you finish up with this video, make sure to check out the 100+ additional videos in my Historical Mysteries series. Imagine standing on a dusty platform in Pretoria during June 1900, while the distant thud of British artillery rattles your teeth and coal smoke from a locomotive chokes the air. You watch as frantic officials heave heavy wooden crates into a baggage car, knowing it's the last chance to save the lifeblood of a dying nation from the greatest empire on earth. Those boxes were reportedly filled with gold bars, raw bullion, and thousands of coins. As that train pulled away into the sunset, it carried a secret that would spark a century of obsession and high-stakes detective work across the globe. To understand why this legend refuses to die, we've got to look at the ground beneath the Boer's feet. In 1886, everything changed for the South African Republic when gold was found at Langlot. This massive discovery turned a struggling farming community into the world's gold capital almost overnight, attracting thousands of desperate seekers. This wealth brought thousands of foreigners, called the Uitlanders by the Afrikaners, who the Boers saw as a threat to their sovereignty and traditional agrarian lifestyle. The British Empire needed gold to back its global currency, leading to tensions that exploded into the Second Boer War in 1899. President Paul Kruger established a national mint in 1892 that eventually processed a vast quantity of the entire world's gold. As the clouds of conflict gathered, the government took several preventative measures by banning gold exports and commandeering coins from private banks to build a substantial war chest. By May 1900, British forces were at the gates of Pretoria, and the situation became dire for the Republic's leadership. Kruger left the capital by train on May 29th, but the gold stayed behind for a final, frantic evacuation. On June 4th, just hours before the city fell to the advancing troops, Attorney General Jan Smuts arrived at the mint to empty the vaults. It's hard to overstate how chaotic those final hours were for the Republic's leaders and the bank officials involved. Witnesses described seeing wagons filled with wooden boxes being rushed from the mint to the train station, while British cannons echoed nearby. Smuts met with the head of the mint, Jules Perrin, and the National Bank manager to ensure every bit of gold was weighed and recorded before it was sent away. That last train steamed out that afternoon on the Delagoa Bay Railway, which was the only line still under Boer control. When the British occupied Pretoria the next day, Lord Alfred Milner's audit found over £1.5 million missing from the national treasury. To put this in context, in present-day value, this was over $100 billion worth of gold. That missing wealth is the foundation of the legend of the Kruger Millions, fueling countless expeditions into the wilderness. The British were convinced the Boers had hidden a massive stash in the rugged interior of the country to fund future resistance. As the conflict shifted into a brutal guerrilla phase, the Boer commandos desperately needed money for supplies and international weapons purchases. The most popular theory is that the treasure was buried in the Lowveld, specifically near the Blyde River Canyon. The legend says a select group of soldiers buried the gold in a secret location, but didn't survive the conflict to reveal the spot. One dark account comes from a man named John Holtzhausen, who made a startling confession in 1905 while in prison. He claimed he was hired to bury gold and diamonds worth £2 million during the retreat. He told a story of stumbling across a skeleton with gold bars, which led to a betrayal in the bush. Holtzhausen's companion, Philip Schwartz, allegedly slew his partners to keep the location a secret for himself. Schwartz was eventually executed for another crime, taking the treasure's location to his grave and ending the official search. While the buried treasure stories get the headlines, there's a more grounded theory that the millions were moved to Europe by Willem Leids. Leids was Kruger's diplomat and managed the Republic's financial assets in several European courts. In May 1900, a ship left for the Netherlands, carrying over 13,000 pounds of gold from southern Africa. While this is far from the 1.5 million pounds that were missing from the treasury, it suggests an organized movement of this gold wealth out of the nation. Some scholars have proposed that this was just one of many such ships that transferred gold to Europe. Upon arrival, according to the theory, the Boer gold was transferred to Switzerland, where the wealth was subsequently plundered by government officials. This version suggests the money wasn't lost to the earth, but laundered through the emerging global financial system for personal gain. The mystery took a wild turn in 2021 when a collection of over 900 gold coins was found in a Swiss vault. These coins were produced between 1893 and 1900 and were stored in the Netherlands before being moved to Switzerland sometime in the 1930s. The South African Mint eventually bought the collection at auction and brought the coins home to sell to local collectors. While these coins haven't been officially tied to the Kruger Millions mystery, it lines up with the theory that the gold was brought to Europe and hidden away. In the end, it remains unclear whether there's truly a missing hoard of gold somewhere in South Africa or hidden in a Swiss vault, or whether the majority of the wealth was used to fund the war. Bermuda's waters have claimed hundreds of ships over the centuries, so much so that the popular myth of the Bermuda Triangle still surrounds the region. The island sits in the Atlantic, surrounded by shallow coral reefs that have torn apart vessels since the earliest days of European exploration. It's a graveyard, and the remains of those ships have sat on the ocean floor for hundreds of years, waiting for someone curious enough to go looking. In 1955, that someone was a 30-year-old Bermudan diver named Edward Tucker, known to everyone as Teddy. Tucker wasn't some weekend hobbyist. He'd been obsessed with the ocean since childhood, growing up close to Hamilton Harbor. He'd worked at the Bermuda Aquarium as a boy, served as an underwater demolitions expert for the Royal Navy, and returned home to build a life around the sea. By the mid-1950s, he was one of the most experienced divers on the island, regularly exploring the wrecks that littered the reef platform. On a September day in 1955, Tucker was diving at a site he believed to be the wreck of the San Pedro, a Spanish galleon thought to have gone down in the 1590s. He'd already pulled up coins, gold bars, and various other treasures over several dives. Then, roughly 30 feet below the surface, Tucker lifted a heavy plank of wood and found something extraordinary lying face down in the sand. It was a cross, and when he turned it over, 7 large green emeralds caught the light. The piece was made of 22-karat gold, measured about 3 inches by 1.5 inches. It featured tiny gold nails hanging from rings on its arms, likely representing the nails of the crucifixion. The emeralds were cut in a style dating back to the Middle Ages, and the craftsmanship, while beautiful, appeared to be the work of New World artisans rather than jewelers from Spain. The cross also had a removable back, concealing a small, empty cavity, presumably once used to house a sacred relic. It was, at the time, considered one of the most valuable single objects ever recovered from a shipwreck. Tucker's discovery didn't just make him a world-famous treasure hunter. It also created an ownership dispute with the Bermudan government, which argued that the territorial seabed belonged to the British Crown. Tucker reportedly told them that if that was the case, he'd take everything back to the reef and let them search for it themselves. The government relented, and Tucker retained ownership. Despite this, Tucker wasn't interested in selling to the highest bidder. Numerous individuals and institutions put in unsolicited bids, and at one point the American ambassador to Italy sent a representative to Bermuda. That agent had simple instructions that few people could turn down: acquire the cross at any cost. Despite being told to name his price, Tucker refused to consider the offer, believing that the cross was the equivalent of the crown jewels of Bermuda. He eventually agreed to sell the entire haul from the San Pedro site to the Bermudan government for roughly £35,000. This was a fraction of the value of the cross alone, and Tucker simply wanted the money to fund further searches. The government placed the cross on public display in an aquarium of all places, where it remained safely stored for years. In February 1975, Queen Elizabeth was scheduled to visit Bermuda to survey the island. As part of the royal visit, the San Pedro treasure collection was to be transferred from the aquarium to the newly established Bermuda Maritime Museum. There it would be displayed for the Queen's inspection, and Tucker was invited to serve as a guide for the presentation. The treasures were packed up and transported to the new location, and several people handled the items as the display was arranged. Everything seemed to be in order. Then, just moments before the Queen arrived, Tucker took one last look at the display. Something about the cross bothered him. It didn't have the same weight or the same presence he so clearly remembered, so he reached out and touched it, and gold-colored paint came off on his hand. The Tucker cross had been replaced with a cheap replica, and the paint wasn't even dry. Tucker was stunned, but there was no time to raise an alarm. He quickly removed the fake and rearranged the remaining treasures. He composed himself just in time to present the collection to the Queen, as though nothing had happened. The visit went smoothly, but behind the scenes, a crisis was unfolding. The police investigation that followed revealed just how vulnerable the cross had been. The key to the safe housing the cross at the aquarium had been kept in an unlocked cabinet. The fact that the paint on the replica was still wet when Tucker discovered the switch suggested the swap had occurred in the preceding couple of days. Detectives believed it likely occurred during transit between the aquarium and the Maritime Museum. The window of opportunity was narrow but apparently sufficient. Bermuda's police force wasn't used to this sort of crime, and they called in reinforcements. The FBI, Scotland Yard, and Interpol all became involved in the investigation. Despite this international cooperation, there was almost nothing to go on. Multiple people had access to the cross during the transfer, and nobody involved admitted to knowing that a replica had been substituted. The investigation produced no arrests, no reliable leads, and no recovery of the original cross. Several theories emerged over the years, with most suspecting an inside job, though no evidence supported that claim. Others believed that the sophistication of the crime pointed to something more international, specifically the creation and use of a convincing replica rather than simply stealing the cross outright, suggested to many that the thief was likely a professional. Tucker himself believed that someone had been hired to take the cross, given the planning involved in fabricating a decoy, though he never named who he thought was responsible publicly. The Tucker cross has never been recovered, and the case remains officially unsolved more than 50 years later. What makes it even more painful is that the cross wasn't the only treasure to go missing from Bermuda's museums. In 2005, visitors to the Bermuda Maritime Museum noticed that several other items from Tucker's collection were missing from their display cases, including a gold bar and a gold chain. As with the cross, these items were never recovered either, pointing to ongoing systemic security failures on the island.